Welcome back to Kringle's Christmas Stories, brought to you by KringlesChristmas.com, home of Comet's Choice premium reindeer food. Reindeer tested, Santa approved. Tonight, we're diving into a heartwarming Christmas tale called The Legend of the Candy Cane. You shared this story with us, and we're excited to explore it together. The story takes us to Frostmere, a village perpetually blanketed in snow. It's a place that has, sadly, lost its Christmas spirit. So, let's begin with Chapter 1. The Village That Lost Christmas. Frostmere was a village locked in perpetual snow. Its cobblestone streets wound between cottages that seemed to huddle together for warmth. Icicles dangled from the eaves, and the river that wound through the valley shimmered like a ribbon of silver. It should have been a magical place, especially at Christmas. But Frostmere was missing something vital: Christmas itself. Years ago, the village had been famous for its festive celebrations. The townsfolk would string lights along the rooftops, hang wreaths on every door, and gather around a towering fir tree in the square. They sang carols and exchanged gifts by firelight, while children laughed and played in the snow. But those days were gone. No one could quite remember how it happened. Maybe it was the hard winters, or the years of lean harvests. Perhaps the villagers had simply grown too busy, or too tired. Whatever the reason. Frostmere had stopped celebrating Christmas. The grand fir tree stood bare year after year, its needles dark and dry. The church bells, once so vibrant, now hung silent in the steeple. Even the children, who should have been the heart of the season, barely spoke of Christmas anymore. It wasn't that Frostmere was unhappy. The people went about their lives as best they could. They shoveled snow, baked bread, and warmed their hands by their hearths. But there was no sparkle, no laughter, no joy. It was as if the village had fallen asleep beneath its blanket of snow, dreaming of brighter times that might never return. That was how things stood on the morning of December 15th, when an unexpected visitor arrived. The first to notice was young Maisie Winter, who had been sent out early to fetch water from the well. She stood in the town square, bundled in a patched coat and scarf. When she saw the stranger approaching, he was a tall man in a crimson coat that billowed behind him like a cloak. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, and he pulled a small wooden cart behind him. Despite the frost that hung in the air, he didn't seem cold. Maisie paused, her mittened hands gripping the well's icy rope. She wasn't used to strangers. Frostmere rarely saw travelers in the winter, and certainly not ones who looked so. Unusual. The man's cart was covered with a heavy cloth, but from beneath it, the faintest hint of sweetness drifted into the air. Peppermint and sugar, mixed with something she couldn't quite place. The man stopped in the center of the square and surveyed the quiet streets. His eyes, sharp and gray, seemed to take in everything: the bare fir tree, the shuttered windows, the tired look on Maisie's face. At last, he spoke. "Good morning," he called out, his voice warm and rich. "Might you tell me, young lady, where I found myself?" Maisie hesitated. "This is Frostmere, sir." "Frostmere." The man's face lit up with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Well, a fine name for a village, and I am Lucian Marlowe, a humble traveler with a gift to share." "A gift?" Maisie echoed, her curiosity overcoming her shyness. "Yes, indeed. But I'll need a few more listeners before I can share it properly." He tipped his hat to her.
"Run along now, and fetch your neighbors. Tell them there's a story waiting to be heard."
Maisie hesitated again, then nodded and darted off, her boots crunching in the snow. Within minutes, word had spread to the village like fire through a dry forest. One by one, the townsfolk emerged from their homes, bundled in coats and scarves, to see what the fuss was about. Lucian waited patiently as the crowd gathered. His cart stood behind him, still covered, and his crimson coat stood out against the gray of the square. At last, when everyone had arrived, young and old, curious and skeptical, he stepped forward. "Good people of Frostmere," he began, his voice carrying easily over the still air, "I have come to your village with a tale to tell and a gift to give. It is a gift as old as the season itself, and holds the power to awaken something I think you've lost." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Most of the villagers looked puzzled, but Maisie, standing near the front, could barely contain her excitement. "What sort of gift?" asked Amos Dreg, the town blacksmith. He was a large man with thick arms and a deep frown. "We're not much for frippery here," Lucian smiled. "Not frippery, my friend. Magic." With a flourish, he pulled back the cloth covering his cart. The crowd gasped. Nestled inside were rows upon rows of candies, each one striped in red and white and shaped like a shepherd's crook. They gleamed in the pale winter sunlight, their color so bright and vivid they seemed to glow. "Behold," Lucian said, lifting one of the candies high. "The candy cane!" The crowd stared in silence. At last, Amos spoke again. "What's so special about a stick of sugar?" Lucian chuckled softly. But it's more than a stick of sugar. The candy cane is a symbol, a reminder of the true spirit of Christmas, and it carries a story, one that I'd be honored to share, if you'll listen. The villagers exchanged glances. They weren't sure what to make of this strange man and his peculiar sweets, but curiosity won out in the end. They shuffled closer, drawing their cloaks tightly against the cold. Lucian turned to Maisie, who was watching him with wide eyes. "Would you like to hold one, my dear?" Maisie nodded eagerly. Lucian handed her a candy cane, and she cradled it in her mittened hands as if it were a treasure. "It smells like peppermint," she whispered. "That it does," Lucian said, "and it holds a tale as sweet as its scent." He stepped back, his voice deepening as he began his story. Long ago, in a time much like this, there lived a candy maker named Elias Northwood. He was a humble man with a gift for crafting sweets that brought joy to all who tasted them. But Elias saw something troubling in his town, a growing coldness, not in the air, but in people's hearts. They had grown distant, selfish, and forgetful of the season's true meaning. Lucian's words hung in the air like snowflakes, and the villagers leaned closer, caught in the spell of his tale. And so, Lucian continued, Elias decided to create something extraordinary, something that would remind people of the magic they had forgotten. He spent weeks perfecting his recipe, working late into the night in his tiny shop. At last, he crafted the very first candy cane. He held up the striped candy, letting the light catch its glossy surface. The white, you see, represents the purity of the season. The red symbolizes love and sacrifice. And the shape, a shepherd's crook, is a reminder to guide one another with kindness and care. The villagers were silent, their eyes fixed on the candy cane. Even Amos Dreg looked thoughtful. And so, Lucian concluded, Elias shared his candy canes with his neighbors, and the town began to change. People remembered how to give, how to share, and how to celebrate. The candy cane became more than a sweet treat. It became a symbol of Christmas itself. He looked out over the crowd, his voice softening. "Frostmere, I believe your village can find that magic again." The villagers shifted uncomfortably. It was hard to believe that something so simple could change anything. But Maisie, holding her candy cane, felt a flicker of hope. And that flicker, small as it was enough to light the first spark. That concludes Chapter 1. Now, what are your initial thoughts? Does anything about Frostmere, Lucian's arrival, or the symbolism of the candy cane stand out to you?
Well, it's fascinating how the story sets up this contrast between the physical coldness of Frostmere and the emotional coldness that's settled over the village.
Yes, and Lucian arrives with this almost otherworldly warmth, symbolized by his crimson coat. It's like he's bringing a spark of life into a place that's become stagnant.
And the candy canes themselves are so cleverly used as a symbol. The white for purity, the red for love and sacrifice, the shepherd's crook shape. It's a simple treat, but it carries a lot of meaning.
He really does. And I think that's part of the story's charm. It takes something ordinary, something we might even take for granted, and reveals a deeper significance.
Absolutely. It reminds us that magic can be found in the everyday if we just take the time to look for it.
Well, let's see how that magic starts to unfold in Chapter 2, A Sweet Beginning. The villagers of Frostmere were quiet, as Lucian Marlowe's words settled over them like a blanket of snow. His story had stirred something long buried, a faint memory of laughter and warmth, of bells and carols. But old habits die hard, and the people of Frostmere were not easily moved. "What does it mean for us?" Amos Dreg finally asked, his deep voice breaking the silence. "We're not Elias Northwood's town, and this isn't some storybook. How can a piece of candy bring back Christmas?" Lucian smiled, undeterred by the blacksmith's skepticism. "The candy cane itself isn't magic," he said. "It's a reminder it carries. Each one is a nudge, a gentle tap on the shoulder to say, 'Be kind, give freely, find joy.' The magic, my friends, is in you." The crowd murmured uncertainly. A few villagers turned to leave, muttering excuses about chores and fires that needed tending, but some lingered, their curiosity outweighing their doubt. Among them was Maisie Winter, who hadn't let go of her candy cane since Lucian handed it to her. "Can I taste it?" she asked, her cheeks flushed with cold. "Of course," Lucian replied with a twinkle in his eye.
"But remember, the sweetness is meant to be shared." Maisie hesitated, then broke her candy cane in half. She handed the larger piece to her younger brother, Rowan, who had been hiding behind her coat. His eyes lit up as he accepted it, and for the first time in months, Maisie saw him smile. The simple act didn't go unnoticed. A baker named Greta Gudgeon, who had been watching from the back of the crowd, pulled off her gloves and reached into her pocket for a coin. "I'll take one of those candy canes," she said gruffly. Lucian raised a hand. "No charge, Mrs. Gudgeon. They are gifts." She frowned, but accepted the candy anyway. As she examined the glossy stripes, her expression softened. Without quite realizing it, she turned and handed it to a boy who stood shivering nearby, his coat too thin for the weather. The boy's eyes widened as he accepted the gift, and for a moment, the crowd stilled. It was a small thing, but in that moment, something shifted. That night, the candy canes began to work their magic. Lucian handed them out as he walked the streets, his crimson coat bright against the snow. He gave one to the widow who lived alone at the edge of town, another to the grumpy shopkeeper who never smiled, and a handful to a group of children playing in the square. Wherever the candy canes went, they seemed to spark a change.
The widow baked a tray of cookies and brought them to her neighbor, who hadn't spoken to her in years. The shopkeeper, who had always been stingy, gave away an extra loaf of bread to a struggling family. The children, inspired by Lucian's story, decorated the bare fir tree in the square with popcorn garlands and paper stars. By the time the moon rose high over Frostmere, the village had begun to hum with an energy it hadn't felt in years. Maisie, too, felt the change. As she sat by the fire with Rowan, her half of the candy cane melting sweetly on her tongue, she couldn't stop thinking about Lucian's story. "Do you think the candy canes really have magic?" Rowan asked, his voice soft. Maisie thought for a moment. "I don't know if it's magic, exactly," she said, "but it makes me feel different, like maybe Christmas isn't so far away." Rowan nodded and leaned against her shoulder. For the first time in a long while, the firelight felt warm instead of just bright. Maisie closed her eyes and dreamed of a Frostmere where the bells rang out and the square was full of laughter. And that wraps up Chapter 2.
What strikes me is how these small acts of kindness start to ripple outwards. It's like a chain reaction, with each act inspiring another. It reminds me of the pay it forward concept.
Yes, it's like those little acts of kindness become contagious, spreading throughout the entire village. And it all starts with those candy canes,
Yeah,
which are more than just candy at this point. They're symbols of generosity and goodwill.
exactly. It's as though the candy canes act as a catalyst, prompting people to tap into something deeper within themselves, that inherent human desire to connect and share with others.
And it's interesting how the story focuses on those small, seemingly insignificant gestures. A shared candy cane, an extra loaf of bread, a helping hand. Those are the things that start to melt the coldness in Frostmere.
Yes. And it's a good reminder that we don't need grand gestures to make a difference sometimes. It's those little acts of kindness that have the most impact.
Well, with those thoughts in mind, let's move on to Chapter 3. A Flicker of Light. Elias Hardwick awoke the next morning with a peculiar weight in his chest. He had dreamed of the candy cane, though he couldn't quite remember the details. All he knew was that, when he reached for his coat and felt the smooth curve of the candy in his pocket, a faint warmth spread through him. Not unpleasant, but unsettling in its unfamiliarity. He dressed slowly, his movements deliberate. The house was silent, except for the faint crackle of the fire Clarence had lit earlier. The solitude, once his comfort, now felt heavy, like the stillness before a storm. Elias stood by the window and looked out at the village square. The fir tree, with its handmade garlands and ornaments, seemed brighter than ever in the soft morning light. A small crowd was already gathering around it, their laughter and chatter carrying faintly through the frosty air. With a sigh, Elias turned away from the window and reached for his coat. For the first time in years, he felt an urge to leave his house, not for business or errands, but for something he couldn't quite name. As Elias stepped into the square, he felt the curious eyes of the villagers on him. They were used to seeing him stride through town with an air of authority, but today, his steps were slower, his demeanor less imposing. Greta Gudgeon was the first to approach him, her flour-dusted hands clutching a tray of warm gingerbread. "Good morning, Mr. Hardwick," she said, her tone unusually cheerful. "Would you like some gingerbread, fresh out of the oven?" Elias hesitated. He couldn't remember the last time someone had offered him anything without expectation. "Thank you," he said stiffly, taking a piece. He bit into it, the spicy sweetness surprising him. Greta beamed. "The candy canes have been working wonders, haven't they? Feels like Frostmere's come alive again." Elias nodded vaguely, unsure how to respond. He felt the candy cane in his pocket, its presence a constant reminder of his unresolved thoughts. As the morning wore on, Elias wandered the square, watching the villagers. Children built snowmen and hung new ornaments on the tree, their laughter infectious. Amos Dreg stood at his forge, hammering out small metal stars to hang on the branches. Even Clarence, who rarely ventured far from the Hardwick estate, was helping a young boy tie a scarf around his neck. Elias stopped near the base of the tree, where a basket of candy canes still rested. He reached for one, but hesitated. Instead, he pulled the candy cane from his pocket and studied it. Its stripes gleamed in the pale sunlight, the curve smooth and perfect. "What are you waiting for?" a small voice asked. Elias looked down to see Maisie Winter standing beside him, her cheeks pink from the cold. She held a half-eaten candy cane in one hand and a bright ribbon in the other. "I don't know," Elias admitted, his voice low. Maisie tilted her head, her blue eyes searching his face. "Mr. Marlowe says the magic only works if you share it." "Does he?" Elias said, frowning. Maisie nodded. "Maybe you should try." Elias glanced around the square, his eyes landing on a young girl sitting on a bench nearby. She looked no older than 8, her thin coat patched and worn. She held her hands close to her chest, trying to warm them against the biting cold. Without thinking, Elias crossed the square and knelt before the girl. She looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. "This is for you," Elias said, holding out the candy cane. The girl hesitated, her gaze flicking between the candy and Elias's face. Slowly, she reached out and took it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elias nodded and stood, unsure of what to do next. As he turned to leave, he heard the girl call after him, "Merry Christmas, Mr. Hardwick." The words stopped him in his tracks. He turned back, his expression softening. "Merry Christmas," he said quietly. For the first time in years, the words didn't feel hollow. So that was chapter 5. Elias has finally given his first candy cane. What are your thoughts?
It's such a powerful moment of transformation for Elias. He goes from being skeptical and resistant to experiencing this genuine act of giving. And you can see how much it affects him.
Yes. The story really emphasizes the simplicity of the act. It's not about a grand gesture or a costly present. It's about a simple candy cane given freely and with kindness.
Exactly. And I think it highlights something really important about the Christmas spirit, or even just the spirit of generosity in general. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's about connecting with others and sharing a little bit of joy, however we can.
Absolutely. Well, let's see how Elias's journey continues in the final chapter, A New Beginning. The simple act of giving the candy cane stayed with Elias all day. He returned home to find Clarence waiting for him in the sitting room, polishing his silver candlestick. "You seem different, sir," Clarence observed, setting the candlestick down. "Did something happen in the square?" Elias sat heavily in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I gave away a candy cane," he said, as if confessing a great secret. Clarence raised an eyebrow. "And how did it feel?" Elias considered the question. "Strange, difficult, but right." Clarence smiled faintly. "I thought it might." Elias frowned. "It was just a small thing. It doesn't mean anything." Clarence shook his head. "Sometimes it's the small things that mean the most, sir." The next morning, Elias awoke with a new sense of purpose. He decided to take more candy canes to the square, though he told himself it was only to see if the villagers truly believed in their supposed magic. But as the day went on, he found himself doing more than simply watching. He helped Amos hang metal stars on the tree, holding the ladder steady as the blacksmith worked. He carried wood to the church for the carolers' bonfire, and Maisie Winter tripped and fell in the snow, scattering her basket of candy canes. He knelt to help her gather them. "Thank you, Mr. Hardwick," Maisie said, smiling up at him. Elias felt a warmth spread through him, stronger than the fire in the church or the mulled cider Greta had offered him earlier. "You're welcome, Maisie." By the end of the week, Elias had become a fixture in the square. The villagers, who had once regarded him with suspicion or fear, now greeted him warmly. He found himself laughing more, listening more, and, for the first time in years, feeling truly connected to the people around him. On Christmas Eve, Frostmere gathered around the fir tree for a celebration. The tree was resplendent, its branches heavy with decorations. The church bells rang out joyfully, their sound carrying through the crisp night air. Elias stood near the tree, watching as the villagers sang carols and exchanged gifts. Maisie and Rowan ran past him, laughing as they chased each other through the snow. Clarence stood nearby, a candy cane in his hand, his smile quiet but content. As the stars began to appear, Lucian Marlowe stepped out of the shadows, his crimson coat vivid against the snow. He approached Elias, his gray eyes gleaming. "Well, Mr. Hardwick," Lucian said, "seems you found the magic after all." Elias nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Perhaps I have." Lucian tipped his hat. "Merry Christmas, Elias." "And to you," Elias replied. With that, Lucian turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Though he was gone, the warmth he had brought to Frostmere remained, glowing brighter than ever. From that Christmas on, Elias Hardwick was known not as the village miser, but as one of Frostmere's greatest givers. And the candy cane became more than a simple sweet. It became a symbol of love, generosity, and the magic that can transform even the coldest heart. So there you have it, the end of our deep dive into the legend of the candy cane. What are your final thoughts?
The ending is beautiful in its simplicity. Lucian, the catalyst for change, disappears, leaving Frostmere transformed. It emphasizes that the real magic wasn't about him or the candy canes themselves, but about the spirit of generosity that they awakened within the villagers.
Yes, and it's interesting how the story ends on this note of hope,
Yeah.
suggesting that this change is lasting. Elias becomes known for his giving, and the candy cane takes on this deeper symbolic meaning within the community.
It's a reminder that small acts of kindness can have a ripple effect, changing not just individuals, but entire communities. And it leaves us with the idea that we all have the potential to bring a little bit of that magic into our own lives.
Absolutely. Thanks for dropping by Kringle's Christmas Stories, and have a very Merry Christmas. Remember to get your Comet's Choice reindeer food at cometschoice.com/Grisha John Verge.